Welcome, listeners. This is Sebastian Nothwell interviewing Sarah Whalen. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. Now, which book are you most excited to talk about today?
I am very excited to talk about my second book, All Her Faults, which is an asexual reimagining of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew and very much inspired by 10 Things I Hate About You.
So, I'm already on board. So on board, buckled in, strapped in, ready to go on this ride. Because I love Shakespeare, I love 10 Things I Hate About You, and how are you making this story your own? Because it sounds like it's going to be a hoot.
It's very funny, actually, because I knew I wanted to do an asexual Shakespeare retelling, but I didn't know which of his works to do, and I had actually never seen 10 Things I Hate About You beforehand, but I knew sort of the premise behind it. So when I was watching the movie for the first time, I remember getting to the scene where Mr. Stratford makes the rule about dating for his daughters and thinking, wow, this sounds very similar to Vietnamese parenting logic. And for those that don't know, the stereotype is that first generation Vietnamese immigrants tell their children, no dating until you're married.
Oh no.
Yeah, and it was so funny. So I thought making the characters Vietnamese would work really well for the story because I'm trying to not only tackle a sort of asexual reimagining of the character of Catherine, but also this older sister narrative that we see coming into play in both the play and the movie. And it was really funny when I was telling some of my Vietnamese friends what I was doing. One of my friends had this anecdote where she literally asked her father when she was a lot younger. She asked him, when can I get a boyfriend? And he immediately responded, total deadpan serious, when you have a husband.
Oh my god.
And this is very similar to a lot of stuff that I think a lot of like second generation Asian immigrants hear from their parents is like, they always switch up on you, when you're an adult. Like when I was younger, my mom kind of pulled the same thing on me, like, no boys allowed, like no dating right now. You're not allowed to date. No dating until you're married. And then like the second you hit like your adult age, they start asking for grandchildren.
Yes.
Which has also been my mom. They set you up for failure, really, because you have like no social or dating experience because our parents are very strict about that. And then they sort of wonder why you can't talk to any romantic interest with any sort of like skill. It's like, I have no experience with this. You're gonna have to wait for a little bit.
It was stranger danger, stranger danger, stranger danger. And now you expect me to be able to talk to strangers? Absolutely not. Can't happen.
It was like my mom would look at me weird if I was like, within 10 feet of, someone of the opposite gender. And then when I finally got a long-term partner, she's been making these very subtle comments about it. And I'm like, where was this energy a couple of years ago when you were like, I had moved out and I was in college and I had some friends over where I was living and my mom was across the room and she was also with us and she texted me, no boys, while I have some of my guy friends in the room. And I am grown at this point. I have moved out. I am in college. And that's why when I first saw that scene in the movie, I was like, this is some Vietnamese parenting logic right here. Like, I've got to put Vietnamese parenting and sort of Vietnamese culture into this story to really make it, because 10 Things I Hate About You is classic. Like, even if you don't know really anything about Taming of the Shrew, you know 10 Things I Hate About You. So I thought this would be a way to sort of incorporate my own, like, culture and identity while still keeping with this beloved tale of, like, weird dating dynamic that they're having to deal with, while also just dealing with the fact that, like, dating is weird and confusing for anyone.
Absolutely. I am very excited to read your take on it. It sounds like it's going to be, dare I say, refreshing?
I should hope so, because when I was reading the original play, I come from I don't have an English degree, but I was like very nearly an English major. But in regards to my Vietnamese mother, I think that actually would have sent her over the edge if I did decide to go and get an English degree. But I have loved Shakespeare for so long, and I was reading this play, and there was a part where I was like, this can clearly be taken with the lens of the character of Catherine being sort of kiss repulsed, and I was like, this is so clearly like an asexual story in the making. And when I was watching the film too, there are all these sort of themes that they're hinting at, where I was like, if the term asexual was more of a thing back when that movie was made, there would be way more like sort of essays about how the character of Catherine is asexual and an allosexual and allonormative world, because the movie even, it does things like, they call her a mutant, they act like she's incapable of forming human connections, and she sort of goes along with it. There's a point in the film where Kat and Patrick are talking and she's like, am I that transparent? Oh, baby, baby, I want you. And she's so very clearly making fun of this like sexual desire that he seems to think that she has for him. And I was just thinking, this is such an asexual character. I couldn't like not ascribe this headcanon to her essentially when I saw that. And the movie keeps just reiterating all these things that I feel like ace people kind of relate to. Like, you know, people think we're mutants, people think we're incapable of human interaction and forming bonds, and people think we're kind of tempestuous bitches. And she's so much more than this narrative that the others and she herself has created for herself, that I just had to have an asexual character who does fiercely love her friends and her family and her sister, but is also unapologetically within her asexual identity. Like, my first book followed my main character coming into and having her sort of asexual awakening, whereas I get to do something different with this book wherein my main character is so not willing to compromise on the fact that she is asexual and how that impacts her relationships. So it's not really quite an awakening story so much as this is what I'm not willing to compromise on.
And it is, again, I feel like I'm going to keep using this word, refreshing to see a character take a stand on their identity and not have to compromise for it, as I understand it, the ace community is expected to so often.
Yeah, that was something that when I was first figuring things out, nowadays there's a plethora of asexual stories and there's something for everyone along the spectrum, and I really appreciate that now. But back when I was figuring things out in college, I just felt like there was an acceptance of asexuality with a caveat, and no one really wanted to talk about that caveat, but it felt to me like a lot of the media or like the asexual characters that I was seeing, there was still that little like expectation that this asexual character would eventually like put out for like either the right person, or there was always this very clear like not every asexual is sex repulsed, and it was like that part, like that exception sort of to the rule, I guess for lack of a better term, was so prominent where I was seeing these asexual characters, and I just felt like it went too far in one direction. Like, yes, ace people can have positive relationships with sex and have sexual relationships with their partners, but I felt like there was this underrepresentation of people like me who are sex repulsed and would really prefer not to. And we were kind of being silenced in the sense of like, well, not, you know, you don't want to create this stereotype that all ace people are like this. Well, that is true. Like, you know, that shouldn't be an assumption or a stereotype, but you shouldn't cast us aside to try and fit within, like, our very sex-normative, allonormative society at the same time.
Yeah, it kind of comes back almost to, like, the danger of a single story. Where, like, even if the single story is not the single story that has been told, it is still a single story, and we need more than one version of the story to exist at the same time in order to get, like, the full plethora of the human experience and to, like, kind of accurately represent people, if that makes sense.
Exactly, and this is something that I talked about in college, actually, because I studied communications, and I also studied women's gender and sexuality studies, and it's this thing called the burden of representation. And, you know, we've seen this in spaces before where it talks about, like, hey, we shouldn't just have positive, like, only positive stories about this marginalized group of people. Like, we should have a mix of stories. But in the beginning, when there's a limited number of those types of stories, you know, you don't want to be known for a stereotype like the mean lesbian character, for example, because, you know, the burden of representation is like, hey, this is the only XYZ story there is. If this is what the only thing we have, we shouldn't have it be XYZ narrative.
Exactly, yeah.
So, yeah, the burden of representation is something that I think about a lot in terms of, like, the intersection of a lot of, like, my marginalizations in regards to being, like, a queer Vietnamese woman. Because I'm sure there are queer stories and there are Vietnamese stories, but there's only one queer Vietnamese story that comes to my mind right now, and it's A Bun Me for Two by Trinity Nguyen, which releases at the end of August 2024. And it's a sapphic book featuring two Vietnamese main characters, and I remember finding out about this book and being like, wow, this is amazing. I'm so excited for this, but also thinking about the amount of pressure that a story like that must come with, you know, with being one of the only examples of this specific kind of representation. And so writing a story with a specifically asexual Vietnamese main character has been both exciting and very daunting to me while I've been thinking about my own story.
Yeah, and it feels like there's always kind of an unfair amount of pressure being the first or the only or one of the few stories in a particular identity, because, like, you're the only one, so you can only write your story. But if it doesn't meet the expectations of everyone who's been waiting for that story, then people get upset. And that's kind of, I don't know, it feels like a really unfair pressure to put on authors when really the answer seems to be, like, more stories. Like, if we just have more than one story, that would fix it.
That was definitely the pressure that I felt with This Doesn't Mean Anything. Like, I put a lot of this pressure on myself, really, because at the time that I was writing and releasing, I felt like there weren't that many asexual stories out in the world yet. So I was terrified of this idea of, oh no, what if, like, you know, I disappoint someone in my own community? What if I'm disappointing someone in the asexual community who doesn't feel seen with this book? And that was an unfair pressure that I put on myself that I sometimes still struggle with. I'm always wondering, like, oh no, what if an asexual reader just didn't click with the story? And, you know, that's not fair. That's not fair to, you know, the asexual readers that did click with the story. And that's not fair to me because I set out to write a story for myself and this kind of story I wanted to see, and going through that sort of like mental gymnastics with my first book has kind of prepared me now for writing this book. And it's something that I think is a very niche piece of advice, but I think it can help a lot of people, is sort of having that one person. It can be a real person or like a hypothetical person, but having that one person that you're writing the story for. And writing All Her Faults has been made easier because I have a friend who is very similar to me and is very similar to my main character. So anytime I'm thinking, oh my gosh, is this not going to resonate? Is this going to be too specific to this character? Are people not going to get it? I am able to push forward with the knowledge that even if no one else in the world gets it, I know that this particular person will get it and feel seen. And that's really all that matters sometimes, is having that one person that you know will feel seen like no one else. And this person has been super encouraging to me as I was writing this story. And so having sort of like, whether it's a real person or a hypothetical person or like yourself, having someone that you're writing this story for can be really helpful on those days where it feels kind of hard and you wonder if you're doing everything wrong. Just having sort of your cheerleader, in a sense, just to help you get through the story and help you realize that someone out there needs this, even if it's you, you know?
Kind of writing for the ideal reader, because, like, no one can write a book that's going to have actual universal appeal. Like, that book doesn't exist, but, like, a book that means everything to one person is something each of us can write.
Yeah, I get so excited when I come up, because, again, this person is pretty much, they're the same as me, and they're the same as my main character, so anytime I sort of have a breakthrough or I just come up with something, they're like the first person I think of. I'm like, when I get this down on paper, I need to tell so-and-so immediately. And sort of having that sort of excitement to share something has also been really helpful, because I get to share something that no one else knows yet. And I also sort of get that positive validation and feedback, like, hey, what you're trying to do, what you're doing works.
Hell yeah. There's also, like, kind of the universality of specificity in a weird way, that, like, kind of inverse relationship between how specific a story is and yet how many people find something in it to relate to. Even if it's not the whole of it, there is still some part of it that rings very true to them.
Yeah, exactly, because I have a lot of, like, layers and nuance in this story, and I just keep thinking, even if someone really doesn't get one part, they know what this thing is like generally. They know what it's like to feel these things, or they have been in this exact situation before. So there is sort of like something for everyone in this story, in the midst of it being written for one specific person.
Yeah. What would you say drives your storytelling and motivates you to write?
Definitely the stories that I wish I had. So when I was going through my sort of asexual crisis and awakening in college, I just remember it was sort of started by this fear that I would be alone, or that I would have to compromise on something that I really didn't want to compromise on. So my first book, This Doesn't Mean Anything, really was born out of that need to see an asexual character who wasn't compromising her boundaries, but still being in a very loving relationship with a romantic partner, and still being with a very supportive friend group that didn't really care about that. I did a post a while ago about dating as an asexual and sort of bringing up that boundaries conversation with your partner, because it was something that a lot of like my followers and my readers were messaging me about privately, and I thought having a post to sort of like do all the general questions that I was getting asked would be helpful for a lot of folks who, you know, were scared about reaching out or something. And I remember I went up to my partner and I asked him, hey, when I had this conversation with you, what ran through your head? Because he is a cishet allo man. So I knew his perspective was probably going to be helpful for a lot of people who might have been asking. And he said that at the time, he was just like, okay. And it wasn't a big deal to him because he felt like there were more important things. And then being able to sort of, I guess, manifest that kind of relationship that I've always wanted where, you know, my partner didn't care about my strict boundaries regarding things because of my asexuality. I think that was something that I was really wanting at the time, and the fact that I was able to manifest it and show folks that it is indeed possible to have this kind of relationship was really big to me. Like, I told that story and then I ended up with it. We've been together since before I published This Doesn't Mean Anything, so he's been able to sort of see the evolution of, like, you know, this is the product of when I was in a really dark place in regards to my sexuality and questioning things. I wrote the relationship that I wish I had, and then when I ended up with it, it was sort of the validation that, like, hey, this can actually exist for you. You know, like, fiction is fiction for a reason, but when you sort of get these examples of what it can be like, you know, I think that sort of opens up the possibility. Like, when I see queer normative fantasy, I think, you know, in other spaces, heteronormativity is still very much a thing, but if we keep making it so that we have these queer normative fantasy worlds, then it's not going to be that much of a big deal anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it kind of opens the mind to the possibilities of the world we could be building for each other.
Exactly.
And, like, even what a more individual level, like, what is possible for ourselves and, like, what boundaries we are able to assert while still having human connection.
Exactly. And I remember when I was writing This Doesn't Mean Anything, I was struggling with the fact I was like, you know, is it only possible to have the relationship I want with another asexual person, or am I limiting myself? Because the assumption is, you know, ace people can only really be with other aces because other aces would understand. But I think that's incredibly limiting to think about, and it also really doesn't give people a chance to surprise us, you know?
It also doesn't give your partner a chance to discover their ace after they meet you.
Exactly, like...
You might be the first ace person they ever meet.
Exactly, like, I think, especially given the online space that we live in today, I think a lot of people don't realize that, you know, someone you encounter on the street has no idea about any of these things, you know? They don't know micro-labels, they don't know other identities, because we can curate our online spaces pretty well. But, you know, people who aren't in these online spaces probably just have no idea. And showing that it's possible and sort of being someone's exposure into this world, I think, you know, there could be someone that has like this very sort of textbook understanding of what asexuality is, but they won't have any sort of idea of the nuances or the micro labels. So keeping the idea of, you know, ace-allo relationships open, it can really be beneficial for everyone, really.
I'm also kind of reminded of how a lot of people start their queer journeys as allies without really at first realizing how or why they feel drawn to the community, or how, because their own sense of self doesn't match what society has told them a queer person is, they don't quite know yet or have that understanding yet of themselves, and how many quote-unquote allies end up becoming or realizing that they are queer, if that makes sense.
That was definitely me. Like, when I was way younger, I was, like, a very, very staunch ally. Because at the time when I was younger, there was not, like, when I was younger, it was literally gay, lesbian, and straight. There was no nuance or spectrum for gender or sexuality.
Which is buck wild, because, like, you look at old photos of pride marches from, like, the mid-20th century and onward, and, like, there are ace people there. There is the word asexual on a poster, and they are carrying it into the street, like...
Yeah!
But that never reaches the mainstream media, so, like, because queer folks are so divorced from our own history, we have to, like, seek it out, and, like, if we don't know to look, how would we ever find ourselves?
Exactly. exactly. And then, like, back when I was writing This Doesn't Mean Anything, there was barely any asexual resources. And at the time, like, I think I remembered Googling literally, like, sex makes me feel sick or something like that. And the DSM-5 ended up popping up because at the time, it was still, like, sexual aversion was still kind of classified as, like, a mental disorder and not really accepted outside of queer spaces as a legitimate sexuality. So I really had no idea what I was feeling. I just knew that, like, there was no way there wasn't, like, something else under the surface. Like, I wasn't just, like, an overly enthusiastic ally. Like, I was like, there has to be a reason why I'm feeling this way.
Exactly, and kind of like being able to identify what part of your experience isn't lining up with, like, the heteronormative, allonormative expectation of society.
Because growing up, I remember I did have crushes when I was younger, very intense crushes that lasted a while, but I remember thinking the extent of the crush was like, I really want to hold hands with this person, and I really want to hug this person. And then finding out that people were, like, legitimately, like, sort of, like, having fantasies about other people was completely unfathomable to me.
Yeah, explaining allosexuality to my ace friends has been buck wild.
Yeah, we're thinking, oh, maybe it's just because I'm in a small town. I've known these people since we were 5. Maybe that's why I'm not, like, attracted to them in that manner. When I get to college, everything will make sense. And then when I got to college and nothing made sense, it's like, oh, maybe there's just something else going on.
Maybe there's something else under the surface here. But yeah, realizing there were some people who thought, oh, being instantly attracted to a stranger, that only happens in movies. I'm like, no, buddy, that happens to me. Do you want to talk to someone about something? Should I put you in touch with some people? Because there's a community, I think, of people who might relate to what you're saying here.
Wild to me when I was going through the asexual crisis / awakening, as I've deemed my first year of college. Because, like, my school was on the more, like, liberal side, and it was sort of when you saw people from my school, you could the stereotype was you could tell which people were from my school, because we were all, like, queer looking. But, like, our GSA was really not sort of accepting towards a lot of, like, other folks. Like, I knew I wasn't going to be able to find, like, ace resources there. So it was very confusing at the time, like, wondering, like, I know I'm ace. Does that make me queer? Like, am I allowed to sort of, like, have a seat at this table here? And then sort of being known as an asexual writer and sort of being known in this space is wild to me because I'm kind of having to claim that seat at the table anyway. Because aces do go through a lot of stuff because of what society deems lacking with asexual folks. So having to sort of not only go through the fact that I was having the asexual crisis, but also having to deal with the fact that asexuality as a whole was having to fight for its seat at the table was an interesting time for me, to say the least.
Which is also buck wild to me, because the whole point of a community is so we can band together. Why are we kicking people out? That's stupid.
A book that I read last year, it's Imogen, obviously, by Becky Albertalli, who is one of my favorite writers of all time, and she's also a Georgia author, so I feel especially connected to her. But so the character of Imogen has been, like, a very enthusiastic ally her whole life, and is called, like, the token straight in her queer friend group or whatever. And this sort of alienation in the fact that, oh, Imogen's straight, she doesn't get that. Even though the character of Imogen is bisexual, I felt like I related to a lot of the story as an asexual person because a lot of people don't think ace people belong in queer spaces. And so I really related to how Becky Albertalli writes how people are treated in queer spaces, even by other queer folks. And I know it was partially inspired by the fact that Becky Albertalli was forced to come out because of, like, people harassing her for writing queer stories.
That is kind of the double-edged sword of own voices as a movement, because, like, I've never seen a conversation of author identities not turn into a witch hunt for queer authors. And it's frustrating because I think it could be an interesting and productive conversation to have, but we haven't been able to have it without putting real, actual human beings in real-life danger. So until we can do that, we don't get to have that conversation. Sorry.
Yeah, and it's like, the people who are sort of, like, crusading against queer baiting or whatever fail to take into account, like, you are pushing past someone's boundaries that they have set. You are forcing someone to come out, which by the very nature of, like, what you're advocating for, which is, queer representation, you should not do that to someone. You should not put someone who is queer in a space that makes them feel not safe.
Exactly.
Like, I feel like the cognitive dissonance would drive me up a wall if I had to, like, sort of contend with being that kind of person.
Absolutely, yes. I feel like it needs to be understood that coming out is something you do for yourself when you are safe to bring awareness to your community. And I think because coming out can be so freeing and such a wonderful experience, there is pressure to come out when you're not safe. And let me tell you, when you're not safe, it is a considerably less freeing experience. And it isn't something we should force on other people at all, and certainly not lightly.
Exactly. And it's interesting being sort of an identity who is sort of shoved out of queer spaces a lot. Because coming out looks different for asexual people, or at least it kind of looks different for me in my life. Because I know that I am privileged in that, like, I will not face really discrimination for my sexuality, but I will face, like, sort of the burden of having to educate people and having those kind of exhausting conversations about, hey, I'm still a person. Can you treat me like a person and not a robot, you know? And people don't seem to realize that coming out can look like having to educate people, even though that's not really your job as the person coming out, because Google is accessible for folks. You know, I feel like there's always the things, you know, when you come out. It's like you have to sort of do all the disclaimers and everything, or you've got to do all the educating, and you've got to do like the TED Talk or whatever.
And it's never like the just one time you come out, because like
Exactly.
you can't just send out one memo and have done with it. It's over and over again every time. And like the one time you don't put it on yourself to come out, it's like, well, why didn't you tell that person? Are you keeping it from them? It's just like, no, it just wasn't relevant.
Yeah, that's my thing. It's like I find it's like, is it worth me getting into this conversation right now?
Exactly. Like, do I have the spoons to go through that right now? Do I have the energy reserves?
Exactly.
Also, is it safe to have this conversation right now?
Exactly, because you never really know where the conversation can lead you. And like, I live in the South.
Yeah.
So really, like, it's not something that I hide, but it's also not something that I'm gonna broadcast generally.
Yeah.
Like, I broadcast enough of myself online. You know, if you're close enough to me in real life, you know that I'm ace. But unless you are my partner, it doesn't really affect you, like, at all, you know?
Exactly. And also just like, once people find out that you're queer, the entitlement they feel to know every possible personal detail. And it's like, hi, we met 5 minutes ago. Who are you? And do you ask this of all the cishet people you meet? Because I don't think that's happening.
This actually kind of happened when I got with my partner, in that, like, so when I was younger, I was sort of kind of just known as like a goody two-shoes, like prude type or whatever. So like when I was talking with a friend from that time who asked me a lot of like really invasive questions, and I was just like, huh? Like, I don't think this is what people talk about whenever, like, other people get partners. But I think it was sort of like the shock value of, like, you know, who, like, me and the sort of persona that I had getting a partner was just so wild to this person that I was speaking to that they just had to know.
But also, like, are they entitled to know? Do they need this information? Are they your doctor? And if so...
It's even not relevant to my doctor, because I'm like, they're just like, hey, are you active? And I'm like, no. And then it's like, move on.
Exactly.
It's like, I didn't ask for your help and you're not going to give it to me. That's great.
Oh, man. What advice do you have for aspiring authors?
So, my advice is going to come in the form of 2 questions that I saw someone else say you should ask yourself as a writer. I don't remember who posted these, and I feel really bad that I can't credit them. But I feel like they were probably posted by the same person. That's just a guess. I could be completely off base. But basically, as a writer, you kind of have to ask yourself, in the editing stages, am I making this better or different?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, this is something I ran into with This Doesn't Mean Anything, where basically I write on Google Docs, and so I would just have it like on my phone, easily accessible for me to like read over and over again at night and sort of just change little things. And it got to the point where I, like, you know, I had to be like, you have to stop editing at some point. Like, it's never gonna be perfect. You're always gonna have something you want to change. But, like, even now, like, you know, as someone who released her first book for the first time, I just remember thinking, why did I write it like this when I could have done this? Why did I do this? And sort of realizing, like, once you publish, you kind of just have to, like, move on and let go. And learning how to let go was really hard for me, because I was, you know, I'm a perfectionist, and it's really hard for me to even think about This Doesn't Mean Anything without being like, oh, why did I write it like this when I could have done this? And all sort of, like, beating myself up after the fact instead of taking that energy into my newer projects. You know, because there are times where you're like, I'm literally just changing one adjective for another adjective, and this does, like, nothing constructive other than just make me like, because once you start allowing yourself to sort of be like, could have done this, then you just keep going. You're like, I could have done this, I could have done this, when you wrote the best story that you could have at the time with the tools that you were given and the person you were at the time. And most readers, honestly, aren't going to, like, really care if you use, like, one adjective or another. Like, something really sort of minuscule like that is things that I'm thinking of. Or, like, you know, there's a point where it's like, you've added all the 5 senses in the scene. There's nothing more for you to add here, you know? So, asking yourself if you're making something better with what you're trying to do, or if you're just making it different from what it is. And then the other question is sort of for like after the fact, or like not strictly related to the writing process, or it kind of is, but it's asking yourself, is this true for me? And the way you apply this is like when you see sort of like generalized posts or like where they're like, oh, everyone has to do a rough draft and then edit. Is that true for you? Are you the kind of person that has to do like the roughest draft in the world before you can edit? Or are you the kind of person that edits while you write? And while that, like, you know, not everyone agrees with that writing style, if it works for you, it works for you, you know? Or like when you think, especially in publishing, thinking about like, are people going to like this? Or, you know, is this a problem I'm going to have to worry about? If it's something like, oh no, readers are coming away from XYZ trope. Is that true for my readers?
Yes. A very good question. Sorry, that wasn't the answer to the question. That was an affirmation that was a good question to ask.
Yeah, especially because I feel this a lot because I write such neat stories. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so like not market. Like no one's gonna like this. You know, I feel that a lot, especially like as an Asian and asexual writer. I'm always so worried about that. But I'm like, the reason these stories are so important to you and you feel the need to tell these stories is because they're not sort of to market. Like, they're not made to be easily consumable and for the average reader, because you're telling a niche story here and you're going to find your readership. And asking yourself, is this true for me, can kind of help, you know, this sort of identity crisis you have where you're starting to question if you're doing everything right or not. Like, oh, I did this trend like 3 weeks late or something like that. Just anything sort of related to the not strictly drafting part of being a writer. And it even pertains to like social media. It's like, oh, writers are on Twitter and that's where you have to find like your publishing folks or whatever.
Hey, absolutely not true.
Yeah, exactly.
Never touched Twitter. Still alive somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Like I left Twitter a very long time ago. Like, I was like, Twitter's not really the space for me, and if that limits me, then that's just something that I have to deal with, but that's not something I'm willing to put up with. And so it's true that lots of people can find their opportunities on Twitter, and I'm not like knocking it for the potential that it has for folks, but I am saying it is not the end all be all. And sort of asking myself, you know, people are finding their success or whatever on Twitter, but is that going to be true for me when I've cultivated my space elsewhere? You know, asking myself that question has kind of really helped me a lot, again, in terms of like just one, you know, I'm an indie writer who only has one book under her belt, like wondering if I'm doing any of this right, you know?
Yeah. Kind of just reminding yourself that you needed this specific story and it wasn't out there yet, and you know you are not the only person on the planet who needs this specific story and who has not been told it yet. And also, like, every market trend came from someone who wasn't writing to the market trend at that time. Every market trend came from someone who was doing something different.
And especially when you write such niche stories, sort of understanding that there are going to be no comp titles. But the fact that there are no comp titles, or like very, very loose comp titles, shouldn't discourage you from that. Because eventually, someone will market something, and you are going to be the comp title. You are going to be the thing that makes people go, oh, I want to read that because they said this is similar to this. Or if you liked this, you'll like this. Like, you are going to be that for something. But you don't know, and you will never give yourself that chance to if you're so worried about, you know, I'm not to market, you know, no one's going to like this story.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been an incredible conversation, and I am so excited to share it with the world and also to talk with you more further on future author roundtables. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm always very nervous to do podcasts, but this was an incredibly, like, rejuvenating and definitely not scary experience for me that will help me, I'm sure, in my future endeavors not be so psyched out by it.
A proof of concept podcast.
Exactly, proof of concept. I love that.